and I'll try to remember to let you know when class is over to reactivate them. Tonight's class is on American history between 1750 and 1776. So we understood the ancient history, the 700 years leading up to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And we saw this theory emerge among the Anglo-Saxons that even though the king has a divine right to rule, that the people have a divine right to liberty, and that overshadows the king's divine right. We also started getting concepts like jury of your peers, due process, the writ of habeas corpus. We started seeing that there shouldn't be any punishment that's cruel and unusual. We started seeing that. We saw it come to culmination in the British Bill of Rights of 1689, in which they made the king and queen at that time take an oath to those rights. And this is where our founding fathers started to see this stuff, because they started to see history in the United States unfolding a lot like what they had studied in the 700 years leading up to this. So this wasn't new to them. They noticed the precursors of the things that are happening. Now also remember, at this time, the Declaration of Independence, in the Declaration of Independence, it's a series of grievances in the body of it. Those grievances came from the British Bill of Rights because King George had taken an oath to it just like his predecessors. And the things that were going on in the colonies, remember the colonists were still British citizens all the way up to July 2nd, 1776. So they were still British citizens. And they had these rights guaranteed to them, given to them by their creator, but guaranteed protection in that British Bill of Rights of 1689. Also, England at that time was still the most complex governmental system in Europe at this time. So, and it's a constitutional monarchy. And so they saw this history unfolding. We have to understand this history. I know all of you in public school have been told that the Revolutionary War started because of taxation without representation. We've all been told that, right? No, that was the tip of the iceberg. That was the vehicle that took us to the point that the Sons of Liberty started collecting a cache of weapons, and that was one of the things the king was upset about. Remember, they're a constitutional monarchy, so the king has to be in favor with the people or he could lose his head like Charles did. So the king had to he had to be seen as strong. Now, England at the time was going through the First World War. Everybody goes, what? That happened in the 20th century? No. The First World War actually happened when England, that was during the French Indian War. We see that as a singular thing, the French Indian War. It wasn't. That was part of the World War that was going on that Britain was fighting against France and Spain. So there was a bigger war going on across the globe with those superpowers. The French and Indian War just happened to be one, basically like World War II, the Pacific Island, right? That wasn't its own war. That was part of World War II, but that happened to be an area that they were fighting. So the French Indian War in the United States was a lot the same way in that First World War that Britain was fighting. That's how they beat the French and the Indians in the colonies. And so there's a lot of things going on. Britain, during our early American history, they were going through a recession. They were having a hard time. There was little jobs. There was little food. There was little money. The people were suffering, and they were going to the Parliament, to the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and complaining. And the judge, not the judge. Sorry, that's on my mind. The king, same thing. The king decided that he needed to look strong, and so when the people complained that they're going through this recession, one of the big complaints was, well, we sent all these forces to the colonies to help those people in the French Indian War. That's the reason that became the scapegoat in England for the reason why the economy was bad. So a lot of pressure was being put on the king. So the king decided, well, if that's the case, I'll look strong by I'll tax the colonies. And so every time they taxed the colonies, the people would push back, and he would have to drop that tax. So instead of looking strong and bringing this money in and fixing the economy, he started to look weaker instead of stronger. So it came to a point where they decided, well, why is it that the people can keep pushing back and making us drop these taxes? Well, it's because they're armed. It was because they were armed. Now, the April 19th, 1775, the shot heard around the world, that happened because the British troops were marching on Concord to seize a cache of weapons that were collected by the Sons of Liberty. That's what sparked it, when they started to come take the guns. The people were upset, but when you started to come take their guns, that was the last straw. So that's really what started the Civil War / Revolutionary War that happened April 19th, 1775. So we have to understand the American history, what's going on that led us up to this split with Britain. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. The French and Indian War was a theater of the 7 Years' War, which was a world war, which pitted the North American colonies of the British Empire against those of French, each side being supported by various Native American tribes. At the start of the war, the French colonies had a population of roughly 60,000 settlers, compared with 2 million in the British colonies. The outnumbered French particularly depend on their native allies. 2 years into the French and Indian War, in 1756, Great Britain declared war on France, beginning the worldwide 7 Years' War. Many view the French and Indian War as being merely the American theater of this conflict. However, in the United States, the French and Indian War is viewed as a singular conflict which was not associated with any European war. But you didn't hear that in high school, did you? The British colonists were supported at various times by the Iroquois. Now I'm going to butcher these names. They're all Native American names. Catawba, the Cherokee tribes, and the French colonists were supported by Wabanaki Confederacy member tribes, Abenaki and Micog, and the Algonquin, Lenape, Ojibwe, Ottawa, Shawnee, and Wyandot, Huron tribes. Fighting took place primarily along the frontiers between New France and the British colonies, from the province of Virginia in the south to Newfoundland in the north. It began with a dispute over control of the confluence of the Allegheny River and Monongahela River, called the Forks of the Ohio. So that's where the Ohio River, that's what feeds the Ohio River coming in from the north. And the site of the French Fort de Quince at the location that later became Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The dispute erupted into violence in the Battle of Jumonville Glen in May of 1754, during which Virginia militiamen under the command of a 22-year-old George Washington ambushed a French patrol. In 1755, 6 colonial governors met with General Edward Braddock, the newly arrived British Army commander, and planned a 4-way attack on the French. None succeeded, and the main effort of Braddock provided a disaster. He lost the battle of that river name on July 9th, 1755, and died a few days later. British operations failed in the frontier areas of the province of Pennsylvania and the province of New York during 1755 to 1757 due to a combination of poor management, internal divisions, effective Canadian scouts, French regular forces, and native warrior allies. In 1755, the British captured Fort Beauséjour on the border separating Nova Scotia from Arcadia, and they ordered the expulsion of the Arcadians in 1755 to 1764. Soon afterwards, orders of the deportation were given by Commander-in-Chief William Shirley without direction from Great Britain. The Arcadians were expelled, both those captured in arms and those who had sworn the loyalty oath to the king. Natives likewise were driven off the land to make way for settlers from New England. The British colonial government fell in in the region of Nova Scotia after several disastrous campaigns in 1757, including a failed expedition against Louisbourg and the siege of Fort William Henry. This last was followed by the natives torturing and massacring their colonial victims. William Pitt came to power and significantly increased British military resources in the colonies at a time when France was unwilling to risk large convoys to aid limited forces that they had in New France. Why do you think they were hesitant to do that? Because they were fighting in other areas. They were fighting close to their own border, to France. Preferring to concentrate their forces against Prussia and its allies, who were now engaged in the 7 Years' War in Europe, the conflict in Ohio ended in 1758 with the British-American victory in the Ohio country. Between 1758 and 1760, the British military launched a campaign to capture French Canada. They succeeded in capturing a territory in surrounding colonies and ultimately the city of Quebec in 1759. The following year, the British were victorious in the Montreal campaign, in which the French ceded Canada in accordance with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. France also ceded its territory east of the Mississippi to Great Britain, as well as French Louisiana west of the Mississippi River to its ally Spain, in compensation for Spain's loss to Britain of Spanish Florida. Spain had ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana, Cuba. France's colonial presence north of the Caribbean was reduced to the islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon, conferring Great Britain's position as the dominant colonial power in North America. Anybody ever watch The Patriot with, what's his name? Who? Mel Gibson, yes. In there, of course, that's a fictitious story based on historical events. The French Indian War was a very brutal, very bloody, very grotesque, hand-to-hand, face-type combat. You want to talk about guys with PTSD. So a lot of the colonists that fought that did suffer from that. It was marked in their brains indelibly. So the Royal Proclamation line of 1763. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was issued by King George III on 7 October 1763. It followed the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which formally ended the 7 Years' War and transferred French territory in North America to Great Britain. The proclamation forbade all settlements west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, which was delineated as Indian Reserve. Exclusion from the vast region of Trans-Appalachia created discontent between Britain and the colonial land speculators and potential settlers. The proclamation and access to western lands was one of the first significant areas of dispute between Britain and the colonies and would become a contributing factor leading to the American Revolution. The 1763 proclamation line is situated similar to the Eastern Continental Divide, extending from Georgia to the divide's northern terminus near the middle of the northern border of Pennsylvania, where it intersects the northeasterly St. Lawrence Divide and extends further through New England. British colonists and land speculators objected to the proclamation boundary since the British government had already assigned land grants to them, including the wealthy owners of the Ohio Company who protested the line to the governor of Virginia, as they had plans for settling the land to grow business. Many settlements already existed beyond the proclamation line, some of which had been temporarily evacuated during Pontiac's War, and there were many already granted land claims yet to be settled. For example, George Washington and his Virginia soldiers had been granted lands past the boundary. Prominent American colonists joined with the land speculators in Britain to lobby the government to move the line further west. So we've got a dispute over property. Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763. Pontiac's War, also known as Pontiac's Conspiracy or Pontiac's Rebellion, was launched in 1763 by a loose confederation of Native Americans dissatisfied with British rule in the Great Lakes region following the French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763. Warriors from the numerous American Indian nations joined in an effort to drive British soldiers and settlers out of the region. The war is named after Ottawa leader Pontiac, the most prominent of many indigenous leaders in the conflict. The war began in May of 1763 when Native Americans, alarmed by policies imposed by British General Geoffrey Amherst, attacked a number of British forts and settlements. 8 forts were destroyed and hundreds of colonists were killed or captured, with many more fleeing the region. Hostilities came to an end after the British Army expeditions in 1764 led to peace negotiations over the next 2 years. The natives were unable to drive away the British, but the uprising prompted the British government to modify the policies that had provoked the conflict. Warfare on the North American frontier was brutal, and the killing of prisoners, the targeting of civilians, and other atrocities were widespread. In an incident that became well known and frequently debated, British officers at Fort Pitt attempted to infect besieging Indians with blankets that had been exposed to smallpox. The ruthlessness of the conflict was a reflection of a growing tensions between indigenous peoples and British colonists. The British government sought to prevent further violence by issuing the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which created a boundary between colonists and natives. So we've got that going on as well. So that's part of the other reason why we left why George left a large contingent of soldiers after the French and Indian War. Up until that point, the colonists were kind of on their own. They were taking care of themselves. A lot of them were trading with the Indians. But when this battle erupted and everybody had to pick sides, it created conflict. And with that conflict, the colonists said, well, you can't take all the forces away. We need protection. So they left. So George left quite a large contingent of redcoats in the colonies. The Sugar Act and Stamp Act of 1764 to 1765. During the period from 1763 to 1775, the 12 years after the French and Indian War and before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, colonial distrust of Britain grew markedly. Why do you think there's distrust? They just kicked a whole bunch of people off land they promised to. A lot of it were veterans that fought for it. They created bad sentiment with the Indians. There was just a lot of things going on. So there was a lot of mistrust with England. Also, since the king took an oath to defend the rights of those people and yet didn't, it breeds mistrust. A lot like what we have in America today. And the emerging united national identity in America became more prominent. In just over a decade, proud British subjects in the American colonies became ardent anti-British patriots struggling for independence. Thus, that's where our founding fathers were born from. British's economy during the 1700s was based on mercantilist theories that taught that money was power. The more money a nation had in its reserves, the more powerful it was. Britain and other European powers, including France and Spain, actively sought new colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia to stimulate their economies and increase their wealth. Colonies provided cheap natural resources such as gold, cotton, timber, tobacco, sugarcane, and furs. These materials could be shipped back home to the mother country and converted into manufactured goods, which were resold to other countries and to the colonists at high prices. Immediately following the cessation of the French and Indian War, British Prime Minister George Grenville ordered the Royal Navy to begin enforcing the Old Navigation Act. Parliament had passed a major navigation act in 1651 to prevent other European powers, especially the Dutch, from encroaching on British colonial territories. The act required colonists to export certain key goods, such as tobacco, only to Britain. In addition, any European goods bound for colonies had to be taxed in Britain. Although the law had existed for over 100 years, it had never before been strictly enforced. We have the same thing in America. After the Civil War ended in the 1860s, the newly emancipated slaves were being pushed into areas that nobody else wanted to live in. They were tent cities, and they were being abused. They were being abused by the local sheriffs and by the local law enforcement. And so a federal case came about on it, and the federal government knew that they couldn't take the discretionary authority away from the executive branch of government, so they created a thing called the USC 42 1983 lawsuit, which was if anybody operating under the color of the state violated anyone's rights or abused their authority in any way, went above and beyond their authority, they were personally liable with their own wealth to pay those people back. Now, we had that in 1877 is when that law was created. It didn't get used for the first time until 1964 during the Civil Rights Act. Because the French and Indian War had left Britain with an empty pocketbook, Parliament also desperately needed to restock the treasury. Led by Grenville, Parliament levied heavier taxes on British subjects, especially the colonists. First, in 1764, Grenville's government passed the Sugar Act, which had placed a tax on sugar imported from the West Indies. The Sugar Act represented a significant change in policy. Whereas previous colonial taxes had been levied to support local British officials, the tax on sugar was enacted solely to refill Parliament's empty treasury. So there's a big difference to where the money's going. It's no longer coming to the colonies, it was going right back to Great Britain. The same year, Parliament also passed the Currency Act, which removed devalued paper currencies, many from the French and Indian War period, from circulation in 1765. Parliament passed the Quartering Act, which required residents of some colonies to feed and house British soldiers serving in America. These acts outraged colonists who believed the taxes and regulations were unfair. Many also questioned why the British Army needed to remain in North America when the French and of course Pontiac had already been defeated. So by this time, things are starting to calm down with the Native American tribes and with the Indian nations. And now they're starting to get abused. They're starting to, the king's trying to replenish the money stocks in England. He's taxing the colonists more. They've gone against their land. They've started enacting jealously the acts that they had put in place 100 years before that were never before enacted on them or pushed on them, and now it's being pushed on them. They had paper money. Does anybody remember the greenbacks of the Civil War? Okay, it would be a lot the same way if they created these greenbacks, and instead of paying the people back with those greenbacks after the war, they just devalued them and said, well, they're no good anymore. Same thing was going on. And so they were stealing in that manner. They were stealing by just devaluing the paper that they issued. A lot like what's going on in America today, right? Your Federal Reserve note is nothing but a piece of paper that either has value or no value depending on what the globalist bankers decide it should be. Though the colonists disliked all of these acts, they particularly took offense to the 1765 Stamp Act. This tax required certain goods to bear an official stamp showing that the owner had paid his or her tax. Many of these items were paper goods, such as legal documents and licenses, newspapers, leaflets, and even playing cards. Furthermore, the act declared that those who failed to pay the tax would be punished by the Vice Admiralty courts without a trial by jury. Okay, we're violating all of the ancient law that we started from the 1100s, aren't we? Yep. Freedom of speech. Well, we're going to tax your speech. If you're going to put out this leaflet and let people know your political ideology, you're going to have to pay a tax to the king. Right? We've got a little thing in America where a right can't be taxed. Why do you think that is? Where do you think our founders got that ideology from? Right there. What was going on in early American history. Colonists were particularly incensed because the Stamp Act was passed in order to pay for the increased British troop presence in the colonies. Not only did the colonists feel that the troop presence was no longer necessary, they also feared that the troops were there to control them. This military presence, combined with the Vice Admiralty Courts and Quartering Act, made the Americans very suspicious of Grenville's intentions.
Sounds like the 13th Amendment.
Yeah, sure does. Sure does. Declaratory Act, 1766. The Declaratory Act was an act of the Parliament of Great Britain which accompanied the repeal of the Stamp Act of 1765 and the changing and lessening of the Sugar Act. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act because boycotts were hurting British trade and used the declaration to justify the repeal and save face. Why did they need to save face? Because the king, every time he put on a tax and they would push back and he'd have to repeal it, he would start looking weak. So he had to do it in such a way that he didn't have egg on his face. The declaration stated that the Parliament's authority was the same in America as in Britain and asserted Parliament's authority to pass laws that were binding on the American colonies. They didn't like this. They already had their own form of government starting all the way back to the Mayflower Compact, right? They already had their government that was in line with all of the ancient documents that we talked about earlier. Representatives from a number of the 13 colonies assembled as the Stamp Act Congress in response to the Stamp Act 1765 to call into question the right of a distant power to tax them without proper representation. The British Parliament was then faced with colonies who refused to comply with their act. Nullification. Don't like the law the federal government did, I don't have to follow it as the state. That's what nullification is. This combined with protests that had occurred in the colonies, and more importantly, protests which had arisen in Great Britain from manufacturers who were suffering from the colonies' non-importation agreement, all led to the repeal of the Stamp Act. Normally, the economic activity in the colonies would not have caused such an outcry, but the British economy was still experiencing a post-war depression from the 7 Years' War. Another reason for repeal of the Stamp Act was the replacement of George Grenville, the Prime Minister who had enacted the Stamp Acts, by Charles Watson Wentworth, second Marquess of Rockingham. Rockingham was more favorable towards the colonies, and furthermore, he was antagonistic towards policies that Grenville had enacted. So you got two separate parties in the House of Commons fighting. One was prevalent. There was an election, he lost, and now another one's there. One that was more sympathetic to the colonists. Rockingham invited Benjamin Franklin to speak to Parliament about colonial policies, and he portrayed the colonists as in opposition to internal taxes, which were derived from internal colonial transactions, such as the Stamp Act called for, but not external taxes, which were duties laid on imported commodities. Parliament then agreed to repeal the Stamp Act on the condition that the Declaratory Act was passed. On March 18th of 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act and passed the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act proclaimed that Parliament had hath and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and the people of America in all cases whatsoever. The phrasing of the act, now that little phrase right there, in all cases whatsoever, when we get to Patrick Henry's speech, that's an important phrase, and that's where Patrick Henry gets it from. In all cases whatsoever. The phrasing of the act was intentionally unambiguous. In other words, the Declaratory Act of 1766 asserted that Parliament had the absolute power to make laws and changes to the colonial government in all cases whatsoever, even though the colonists were not represented in the Parliament. Although many in Parliament felt that taxes were implied in this clause, other members of Parliament and many of the colonists who were busy celebrating what they saw as their political victory did not. Other colonists, however, were outraged because the Declaratory Act hinted that more acts would be coming. The Declaratory Act was copied almost word for word from the Irish Declaratory Act, an act which had placed Ireland in a position of bondage to the crown, implying that the same fate would come to the 13 colonies. History's important. The Townshend Act of 1767 to 1768. The Townshend Acts, or the Townshend Duties, were a series of British acts of Parliament passed during 1767 and 1768, introducing a series of taxes and regulations to fund administration of the British colonies in America. They are named after the Chancellor of the Exchequer who proposed the program. Historians vary slightly as to which acts they include under the heading Townshend Acts.